Okay, the first thing I'm going to say to you tonight is you shouldn't just believe everything I say. It's necessary for you to go back onto the internet and get the original sources and try and look at the information yourself, see what was actually going on. The more people that we have who look at the information, then the more information we pick up, because it's a kind of situation where the more you look, the more you find. Can I move this on to the first slide? How do I do this? Cool. In order to figure out how the towers were demolished, we first of all got to figure out how they were put together. And the easiest way of doing that is to look at this photograph, which shows quite well, without going into technical drawings, what went on. What we have is an outer perimeter structure consisting of 60 vertical columns per face, approximately 60. The dark band that we see, the dark vertical band that runs up the centre, is the core columns. There were 47 vertical core columns, roughly arranged in a 6x8 grid. It doesn't quite work out, but you're basically talking about 6 rows of 8 columns. Some rows only had 7. That was the main beef of the tower. In particular, the columns which ran around the outside of the core, and that would be column rows 5 and 10. They were the strong, hefty tower columns that held up a significant proportion of the weight. And if you're going to bring the towers down, then the place to attack has got to be the core, those core columns. And that is exactly what we did see. We move right back to the very beginning of the collapse. What I'm going to show you here is what we see here, I'm going to show you is 4 photographs, one after the other. In this particular one, keep your eye on the dark band on the antennae right at the very top, and you'll see that. You see that just beginning to move downwards. That's the first real movement we see, the first indication that the towers are beginning to collapse. And again, you see the antenna beginning to fall. The corner of the building hasn't actually moved down at this stage. So what we can tell from that is that the first element of the collapse was an attack on the core columns. All 47 core columns had to be severed, had to be disassociated in order for the tower antennae to begin to move downwards. This photograph was taken by Aman Zafar from his apartment across the river. And what it actually shows in WTC2, once that the upper section, the walls and the perimeter columns had fallen to the ground, we still see a section of the core remaining. But what this shows us, that there was precisely that. There was a vertical severance of all 47 core columns. And you'll note that that's around about the 60th floor. That's well below the level of the aircraft impact. So we can't say that that severance was caused by the aircraft because it was in the wrong place. We can't say that that was the only severance of all the 47 core columns, but we know there was certainly one because we can actually see that. Now that is probably the most important photograph that was taken on 9/11 when we consider the order of the demise of the tower, how it collapsed. Because not only does it tell us that there was a horizontal disassociation, but if we look a little bit further into that and we do a dimensional analysis of what's left, we can see that this was not the entire core. All 47 core columns are not remaining in that picture. The outer core columns have been removed. Those core columns which were responsible for holding up the floor have gone. Column rows 5, 6, 9 and 10 were brought down at an early stage of the collapse. The weakest core columns, the ones in column rows 7 and 8, they stayed upright. It's also the common denominator between whether the towers fell, the columns fell as a general rule, those columns which were situated adjacent to and accessible from inside the elevator shafts fell at an early stage of the collapse. Those columns which were remote from the elevator shafts and not accessible from the elevator shafts survived the early stages of the collapse. What we're going to look at now is the very early stages of the collapse. The tower on the left-hand side is just beginning to fall forward, and you can see the vague line where the upper section has tilted over. This photograph kicks a major hole in the official story. The 195 you see in the corner signifies the frame that it's taken from. We know that a video camera is around about 30 frames per second, so we're looking at 6.5 seconds into the collapse. And you see that the lowest line of damage is still at around about the 79th floor. The official story would have us believe that the collapse had progressed at this stage to something like 75 or 100 metres below that level, something like 20 stories. It would actually be off the bottom of the photograph. The official story relies on that progressive collapse, and what we can see here quite clearly is that that does not happen. What I'd like you to note on the next photograph I show you is that we see the expulsions beginning to move out as the collapse runs down the tower. What we've got to note in this, particularly with regard to the dust cloud expulsions, are 3 points. One is that they do not come out from every floor. The dust expulsions miss out a floor. Now you'd think if the tower was coming down one floor at a time, the dust and the expulsions would come out every floor. But that's not the case. They come out every third floor, which, if you look at the core columns, we know that all the core columns were welded every third floor. We also see in this photograph, it's more clear. On the left-hand face, we see two distinct areas. It's quite awkward to see, but if you go back and you look at the videos, you'll see that. You see two areas of expulsion. And you'll see that the corners are not involved. There's no expulsions coming from out the corners. So a pancake collapse or a truss failure theory, that kind of thing, we've got to ask the question, why are the corners not involved? The reason for that is that these core columns, the outer core columns, in rows 5, 6, 9 and 10 were taken down by concussive explosions placed adjacent to the welded column sections. Where the column sections were welded together, concussive explosions were placed adjacent to those, every 3 floors. And that's why we see the expulsions coming out every 3 floors. What would we expect to see? I'll just go back to that one for a second. What would we expect to see in the type of failure in the column? What would we see in the debris pile if that had been the case? If you look at the right-hand side, what you'll see is the lower column, the lower part of the column, subject to a concussive explosion, is going to have one face that's concave, bent in by that explosion. And as the column rips across the lower column, it's going to be held in place by the still intact welds, and you're going to see a concave face. So you're going to see opposite faces of the concave box column, opposite faces of the box column will be concave. On the other section, on the upper section, you see that as it comes across, that flange will be torn away because the section's still welded, and as that weld tears, we'll see the flange tearing away. So we would tend to look for exactly that kind of damage in the debris pile. And that's exactly what we see here. We see a box column. It is a core box column. It's an outer core box column. And we see one flange with its end torn away. There are many such these photographs in the debris pile, Again, we can see that very characteristic bend. You'll also notice the colour change of the end of that column. It's a redder colour, a more orange colour than the rest of the steel. That's indicative of a localised thermal event. Something has heated that up. I'd like to get a closer look at that. It's sometimes difficult to tell from photographs, but if we can actually see that column, we can learn much more. But what you see is a thermal event, and you see the particular kind of failure that we would expect. As regards the concave, the opposite concave faces, again, we see exactly that. One of them pushed inwards by the concussion of the explosion, and the other pushed inwards by the weld as it's been torn across. So what we see is exactly the kind of failure that we would expect to see. In terms of the behaviour of the dust cloud, I talked earlier on why the corners were not involved with the expulsions of dust. This is a plan view of the construction of the towers. We see the perimeter columns around the outside, and we see the core columns in the inside. The little pink dots indicate where the columns are around the outside. Now if we take out column rows 5, that's the top one, 6, 9 and 10, the bottom one, we would see on one side of the tower, we'd see two distinct areas where those explosions were coming out. The corners wouldn't be involved because a directional explosion would firstly push out the debris from the mid-face, and it would only be a few parts of a second there that the dust actually came out of the corners, and that's why we see the corners not involved. So again, these pieces of evidence are all beginning to fit together and beginning to match what we'd actually expect. And you'll notice from that, and you'll notice from other plan views, that every single one of those core columns in column rows 5, 6, 9 and 10 were adjacent to and accessible from inside the elevator shafts. And I believe that gets round the argument that's put forward by some people who say, how could you plant explosives in an office building that was being used every day? Well, there's your answer from inside the elevator shafts. We've also heard anecdotal evidence that there was a great deal of work carried out on the elevators beforehand. I'd like to have that properly checked out. As I say, it's anecdotal evidence, and I wouldn't swear to it. What we see here is the spire. Looking at the second tower to collapse, there was a piece of core column, a piece of core structure, which was left after the remainder of the tower had collapsed. And again, if we do a similar dimensional analysis, looking at the relative size and the spacing of those remaining columns, we can tell that all of those columns came from column rows 7 and 8. Those columns which were not accessible from the elevator shafts, and incidentally, the weakest columns in the core. So in the early stages of the collapse, the core columns that fell down were the strongest ones that were situated next to the elevator shafts. The ones which survived were the weakest ones, which were not situated next to the elevator shafts. Moving on to the perimeter structure. Again, I would urge you to look at this video and study this video. This shows us the first stage of the collapse of the perimeter section. This photograph is taken immediately before initiation of the collapse. And the first thing we see is that white band, that white smoke coming out from the corner section. And that white smoke, we see that again and again and again within the collapse. But we see the very beginning where we see this white smoke developing. It doesn't show up very well on the screen capture, but it shows up very well in the video. Moving on, you see, look at the same area where the white smoke was coming out, you can still see it, and you can see a distinct white flash coming out the side of the building. We also see another one in the opposite corner to the square, and where the arrow is, we see again a change in the colour and the character of the smoke coming out of the building. Those 3 points form 3 corners of a square. And if we look at the other corner of that square, that is the area where we see the molten metal pour in from the building. Molten metal which is totally unexplainable within the confines of a jet fuel fire. you can't melt steel with jet fuel at atmospheric temperature, atmospheric pressures. We also see on that corner another totally unexplained phenomena as far as the official story tells us, the white rectangle. We see, again, the distinctive white smoke, and we see a totally unexplained, what looks like white hot section within the towers. Now, I'd ask you to consider, what are the chances that those 4 events would happen on only 2 floors out of the 110, and they would happen at the same position relative to the corners, and it would happen at the same time immediately before collapse initiation? I'd then ask you to consider, what is the chances that those events were totally unrelated to the fact that immediately after collapse started, all those 4 positions become major seats of failure. And what I mean by that is, if you're talking about a bend, that major seat of failure is right on the point of the bend. In all 4 cases, we see that when we see the flashes of light, when you see the changes in the colour and the character of the smoke emissions, immediately afterwards, that area becomes a major seat of failure. That's not a coincidence. The photograph has turned out very badly, but we're talking about 4 events, 4 areas. But again and again and again, on more and more videos, we can see these white flashes of smoke and the changes in the colour. That was another one, but it's not a very good reproduction. Again, we can see one there. Again and again, we see these throughout the tower. You can understand 1, you might think, well, that's a coincidence. 2, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Again and again and again, we see the white flashes, the colour changes in smoke, then becoming major seats of failure. What I mean by major seats of failure, we see the upper section beginning to fall over. We see it tilting over. But that upper section hasn't fallen over as one section. If you look at the line of the core columns, you can see a distinct bend in those corner columns. And that is exactly the same position where we saw the white flashes. And again, you can still see the white smoke. So the point's being made that those columns were taken down deliberately by charges placed in the corner. They were placed 4 to a floor, every 15 or 20 stories down the building, and they went off in unison to break up the perimeter corner structures. The next 4 sequences of video captures, I'm going to show you the beginning of the collapse. The bottom red line shows you what we call the collapse front, or the destruction front, and that will progress down the building. The upper line obviously shows the top of the building. But the first movement, the first volume, the first volume to be crushed was the volume between, say, the 80th and about the 95th floor. It was not, as the official story would have us believe, that the upper section fell as a solid mass and crushed the lower building. The first mass to be crushed was the area above the impact level. And incidentally, if you look on the right-hand side, the point I was making about the expulsions only coming out every 3 floors, you can see that quite graphically there, because there's a definite gap between the smoke in the upper section and the expulsions of the dust coming out the right-hand side. Next photograph again shows that the upper section has almost disappeared inside the lower section, and the lower section hasn't started to move downwards. So the first volume to be crushed was that volume above the aircraft impact level. The corners, again, I'll go back there a second. You can again see on this one, although not as well, that the corners were not necessarily involved in the dust expulsions at the early stages of the collapse. And here we see one of those corner sections still surviving. The upper section, the walls and the floors have fallen down, but these corners are still standing. They're still standing above the debris field. And again, in this one, right at the top centre, we see, again, a corner still surviving. So we've got to ask the question, how were those columns taken down? And as I've talked about the charges that were placed on those corners. This one is perhaps the most obvious. Again, I'm going to show you two photographs. The first one, the black line beside the red triangle, the black vertical line beside the red triangle, shows us a piece of those corner sections still surviving after the collapse has progressed beyond it. And we see the distinct white flash that's centred exactly on that column. If we move on just a few parts of a second, we can still see the bottom of the vertical column still remaining. The area which was above the white flash has gone. Again, that was taken down. The final stage of the collapse was the core. And again, these are the final core columns falling over. That core remnant that I showed earlier on, those are finally being fallen over. Again, the white smoke, the eddies of white smoke trailing behind these columns as they fall. We see these flashes, this is probably accentuated by this photograph, but we see these distinct white ends on these columns. When you break a piece of steel, you don't get white ends. Something else caused that other than just the fracture. And you should also note the remarkable straightness of these columns. If these columns were buckled and bent and torn over, you would expect them to exhibit that. You would expect to see bends, but what we actually do see is long, straight sections with very clean-cut ends. So the towers were brought down by a series of by 4 phases of attack. The first attack was a complete horizontal severance through all 47 core columns. Second attack was on the outer core columns to take out those the strongest core columns in the building, every third floor placed adjacent to the welds. The outer structure, the corners of the outer structure, were taken down by incendiary charges. Every 15 to 20 stories, 4 per story, situated in the corners. And the final section of the collapse, of the destruction, was to finally put paid to the remaining core columns. There is much more evidence that I can show you. Obviously, time constraints mean that I've had to zip through this very quickly and pick out the best pieces of evidence to show you. But there's many more pieces of evidence. There's many more questions that remain unanswered. There are some photographs that, quite honestly, I've stood and stared at them for hours on end, and I cannot figure out what I'm looking at. The more people we have looking at those, the more likely we are. There's questions to ask like, why were over 1,000 bodies completely unrecoverable? From a gravity-driven collapse, we know that in an earthquake, people are dug up alive for days afterwards. Bodies are found in gravity-driven collapses. In this one, over 1,000 bodies, no trace whatsoever, no DNA trace. Where did they go? And there's one final point that I'd like to make. I'm going the wrong way. It's easy to talk about the towers in technical terms. It's easy to say, for instance, that the first volume to be crushed was the volume between the 80th and the 95th floors. But every so often there's a wee voice at the back of your head just says, remember there were people in there at the time, still alive. And remember there was people who walked into those buildings, knowingly walked into danger, just the same as they do every day in countries throughout the world. And they don't do it for personal gain, other than their wages. They don't do it for personal glory. They just do it to help people. This was their reward. And that's the question that I'm going to ask you tonight. Are we going to let that stand? We're just going to shrug our shoulders and walk away? That's the question I'm asking you. I'd like to thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.